Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Katrin Hohl, Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at City St George's University in London.
that's quite a title, Prof. Do you remember that always, or do you need to write it down? I think I'd have trouble recalling all those words.
When we choose our professorial titles, there is this worry that somehow it would limit you if you choose something very specific, for example, what you're working on at a particular time.
Yeah.
Now, knowing myself, I tend to want to switch topics every few years and not stay too closely wedded to a particular theoretical framework or a particular topic, although I have stayed on the same topic for 10 years now. So I've given myself a lot of space by choosing criminology and criminal justice.
Great. And Prof, I want to begin by asking you what I pose to everybody, which is to share with us what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you. What's going on for the Prof?
Oh, that's lots and lots of things to feel at the same time. I might dive into that in relation to the topic I work on. So
Mhm.
I work on how policing and the justice system in England and Wales deal with rape, sexual offences, sexual assault. So how police investigate it, how they engage with victim survivors, and what happens when these cases move forward through court. So what's dynamizing me, not sure I've heard that word in that way before, is the possibility for change that exists right now. I think there's been an openness within a policing world that we probably haven't seen before in that way, which lots of opportunities for change, and we can talk more about the work I've done in that space. What's impeding is we have a criminal justice system that is so broken, it's de facto self-abolished itself. So, while some academics write about should or shouldn't we abolish policing and criminal justice, de facto it's been grinding to a halt in a way that some say, well, it barely exists anyway. We have long backlogs in the courts, so there are around 90,000 cases waiting to go to Crown Court. It's typical for a rape case now to have to wait 4 or 5 years to go to court. So the system has really is in a crisis point, and the government here in this country are trying to introduce some very radical reforms to try and get it functioning again. That's impeding in a way that if you've got a system that's this broken, there are lots and lots of questions about should you try and attempt to get more cases into it? What are you doing there? So I suppose that's also preoccupying me in some way.
Mm.
What really interests me is an end-to-end perspective. So when I started working on this topic, I was mostly interested in the policing side of it and probably quite interested in it from a perspective of police legitimacy, police relations to victim survivors. So much of the policing research thinks of people's encounters with the police either in the role of suspects, so in stop and search, or as a general member of the public. It doesn't really think about it and has taken a very long time to even begin writing about it in the scholarly field as when you encounter the police as a victim and when that victimization is something as loaded and difficult and personal and traumatic as rape. And in fact, women are much more likely to encounter the police in the role of a victim than a suspect. So women haven't really been thought about very much in a policing context at all. So what's interesting for me now is having spent most of my career looking at policing, is to work my way through the justice system towards the courts. And it's a system in that the police, and in England, we have a Crown Prosecution Service that makes the decisions whether a suspect must be charged or not and prosecutes on behalf of the Crown. And we have the courts. And it's a system in that all of these agencies somehow impact one another and depend on another. But it's not a system in that it's been designed to function well together. It's actually surprising how disconnected they are. And that is interesting to me, is sort of also understand those cultures, not just police cultures, but court cultures, um, lawyers' cultures, judiciary. It's quite different. That's probably quite a long-winded answer, but I'll it's probably given you some material to pick from what you'd like to talk about more.
No, that's a great response. Thank you so much. And for people outside the UK, often, especially in the Americas, but not only, England is the word used to describe the United Kingdom. In
Mm,
fact, it's four countries,
that's right.
allegedly independent and with certain independence in some areas. And so when you refer to England and Wales, that means Wales, which is sort of southwestern tip of Britain, as it were, and England, which is the economic and governmental powerhouse of the United Kingdom, and which reaches about halfway up, or two-thirds of the way up, Great Britain. So you're excluding Northern Ireland, you're excluding Scotland from this because England and Wales are much more tightly connected constitutionally when it
That's
comes to a
right.
lot of
So
involved areas.
England and Wales have a joint justice system that is the same, and they have the same legislation. Now, Scotland has a different justice system. It's got a completely different setup. It, in fact, also has different laws. For example, the law on rape is ever so slightly different. They have case outcomes, which we don't have in the UK. So we either have guilty or acquittal, and they have sort of a halfway house one. And then Northern Ireland is also different. That's right. So that's why I'm talking about England and Wales, because the four nations, it might be surprising to people who look at the UK and think, well, it's a tiny set of islands. How can you squeeze four justice systems onto it? But we have. So yeah, so I'm speaking about England and Wales because that's where my research
That's
is.
really well. And it's important to note that these countries have absurdly powerful roles in FIFA. So anything people don't like about football, you can blame on the British Empire because they get four votes when they should have one. The same when it comes to lots of sports, but that's not your concern. One of the big things about England is that it has one of the most powerful and centralized policing systems one can imagine, the so-called Met, the Metropolitan Police Force. And this is a police force that has seen untold scandals over the last, well, really 200 years, but especially the last 50 in terms of corruption, racism, sexism. But from what you're saying, I gather that the Met and other police forces in your ambit are actually serious about reform.
Yeah. So in 2021, I was involved in leading, and this is work I've done together with Professor Betsy Stanko. We've jointly led a series of projects that were about changing how police deal with rape and sexual offending. So when we began this work in 2021, the charge rate, so the number of cases police have recorded of rape in which someone was charged and had to go to court was around 1%, 2%. It's effectively decriminalized. Very, very few cases went through. And when you traced where they fell out of the system, 9 out of 10 times it was the police chose not to even send it to the Crown Prosecution Service for making a decision. So they closed the cases. Some it's the victims withdrew, so they may have reported and changed their mind. And we've found out a bit more now. Actually, some of what's reported in that way, actually, those victims never really wanted the police that involved. Um, so the situation was really dire. And now Betsy and I are close friends, but we're from different generations. Betsy's in her 70s now. She's an academic in the 80s in America. She's a very influential feminist scholar and policing scholar. And what we share over sort of the decades of in age between us is an absolute frustration with how can we be in this situation. There's been 40 years of academic research in the UK, government report, inquiry after inquiry, describing the problems. and making recommendations. And if you put them side by side, whether they're from the 90s or from 2020, the recommendations were the same. There was just no change. So we thought we've got to do something different. So we worked with a tiny police force at first, Avon and Somerset Police. They're sort of in the southwest of England. It's a quite rural area. It's got one big city, Bristol, which is the university town. And their now Chief Constable Sarah Crew, a very courageous police leader, invited us in. She said, so we got a bit of grant money, and she was very courageous. She said, you can do any research you want, you can look at everything, and we know what you'll find will be uncomfortable to hear, but we want you to tell it to us as it is. So she was incredibly courageous. This is not what we normally see. Normally, there is an attempt to deflect. Or academics are kept at arm's length. You might be given some data, then you go away, you write a report, they say, thank you very much, and now please go away. And that's not what we did. And Betsy, so she was an academic for a couple of decades, and then she worked within the Metropolitan Police for some years. So quite a lot of experience within policing. And I had done a lot of research with the Met. So we went about it in a different way. So we thought if this was actually going to make a difference, two things must happen. One is we have to work together with policing in a very different way to get the openness. And B, we have to stay with them after the findings come to develop solutions. So we condensed the existing evidence base into a framework, and you can read about that. It's our 5-6 pillar framework, where we put together what we already knew. Then they gave us access to everything, to case files, body-worn video recordings. We spoke to victims and survivors through local victim support organizations. We looked at their learning and development, their data, their digital forensics, what they do about repeat perpetrators. And we produced some really quite uncomfortable findings. But we shared with them as we went, and then we worked with them to say, we're not just going to do some recommendations and then they'll be like all the previous ones and they'll sit on a shelf and nobody quite knows what to do with them. But let's work together on solutions. And we carried on working with them. And then that piqued the interest of the government. So we were able to get a very large grant, and we repeated the same exercise with the Metropolitan Police and with 3 other police forces around the country. And what that resulted in is, for the first time ever, there is now a so-called national operating model, a national system for how to deal with these types of crimes that was developed by us as academics. It's an incredible thing to allow. We were over 50, the team we led were over 50 academics, most of them feminist, all of them left-leaning, and policing let them traipse over everything. This is not what policing normally does. And so we're a few years on now. So this national framework has been implemented by all forces. They get inspected against whether they do it or not. And the charge rate now is about 10%. That's a huge increase. And that's even and at the same time also reporting has gone up. So there is a possibility for openness. Now you mentioned the Met, like probably more than other forces in the country, have had so many scandals, and really they're back up against the wall. You might say they didn't have much choice but try something different. Yeah, I mean, yeah. And then they're saying because the Met is so big and so dominant, the saying in policing is if the Met sneezes, the rest of policing gets a cold. It's sort of whatever happens in London will set the tone for elsewhere. Now, in this instance, what happened in a tiny police force in the west of England is what set off the change, but the Met is certainly part of it. Now,
Prof, you mentioned the 5 pillars that you guys have developed: suspect-focused investigations, disrupting repeat offenders, using procedural justice as an approach for the meetings of victims and survivors with police and others, officer education, and data use, I think the 5.
yeah.
Share with us a little bit about those.
Yeah. And in fact, that's what we started. And then we realized we made a mistake. And then a sixth pillar was added, which was
Oh,
digital.
I don't know about number six. My God, I'm out of date.
Number six. No, yeah, so we started off
Save me,
with
Prof.
five. Yeah, so and then we realized we hadn't gotten on board with how the world had changed. So digital forensics had to change. So how did they come about? What are they? So the first three pillars were what you might describe the workhorses of day-to-day police work. So the first one was investigations. And what our research found, and very much consistent with other research, is when it comes to rape, police were investigating the credibility of the victim first and foremost. We found evidence in the case files that often the suspect wasn't even interviewed or looked at. It was all about, based on quite deeply rooted in myth and misconceptions about rape, that rape is rare, women often make these things up. So you must spend all your time looking at the person reporting the crime rather than what's being reported. And so we wanted to move away from a victim credibility investigation approach to one that focuses on what's actually been reported. So the suspect focused investigation means, I mean, offending begins with offenders, and maybe an easy way to describe it as well. Police previously, let's say, the rape that is reported happened at the end of a night out. They would ask her, how much did you have to drink, and where did you go that night, and how much time did you spend here, and who were you with, and what were you doing? Now we are telling the police, follow him through the night. Where did his night start? Did he try and find other women that looked suitably drunk before? Is there evidence of him almost searching for somebody drunk and vulnerable enough? Follow him through the night. Don't ask how much did she have to drink. Ask who controlled how much she drank, who poured the drinks, who kept topping them up. Um, that's sort of the suspect focused approach. The second one is a key sort of accepted finding within criminology is that a relatively small number of perpetrators account for a very large amount of the harm. Put bluntly, in the context of rape, is we don't believe that there are 100 men who do a rape each. We think it's far more likely there might be 8 or 10 doing 10 each, or something like that, or perhaps five doing even more. So once you cross that line, you might do it time and again. And police weren't joining the dots at all. So we noticed that when we did the research, they weren't even running people's names through the system. Everybody assumes, based on crime fiction, that that would be the first thing you do. And in the cases of rape, 9 out of 10 times the victim can give you the person's name, their phone number, their address, and so forth. They know who did it. It's mostly somebody you know. The stranger danger is fairly rare. So they weren't doing that. So it was about how can police identify high harm repeat suspects, and also how can they be stopped? Of course, criminal prosecutions is one route, but as we've spoken about already, it takes a long time. There are other things police can do to disrupt. There are civil orders. You can be a lot more creative. Sometimes even just calling someone for interview and signaling to them, you can't get away with this. We are beginning to take women seriously is an intervention. So that's that. And the third is how police engage with victims. Well documented for decades is that they often do that very poorly, with very little idea about how to be trauma informed, but also just a wider framework of not really engaging with somebody who's had something really terrible happen to them in a way that gives them voice, allows them to participate in the process, treats them with dignity and respect, unbiased decision making, so not shaped by myth and misconceptions, and with some trustworthy motives at heart. So those were the things. So we wanted police to move to that. But it was clear to us that there was absolutely no point in just saying, you're doing it wrong, you need to do it this way. If it was that easy, things would have changed already, because we weren't the first to find any of this. There have been plenty has gone before, so we knew it wouldn't be that simple. So we thought we have to enable them, and police organizations need to take organizational responsibility for its officers. So away from pointing at a few bad apples or say, well, the problem is Officer X. If if the problem is this systemic, you must take organizational responsibility. So how are you going to put them in a position? How are you going to ensure and be accountable you're putting your office in a position to do number 1 to 3 better. So one was learning and development, and an ongoing joke between Betsy and me is that I wanted to just remove it because, in my view, training police officers was pointless. It never had resulted in anything, and it was the go-to excuse by officers or by organizations when there was a big scandal. They would say, "Oh, sorry, our bad. We're now training officers." It was sort of the fig leaf to hide that you haven't done any structural change at all. So I thought, I want to remove that fig leaf. I don't want them to hide behind training. It's not good enough. Betsy put her foot down, and she was obviously right. And now training is, when done effectively, it was also about officer well-being and organizational justice. So if officers themselves experience racism, homophobia, and misogyny, if they're not treated well by their organizations, guess what? They're not going to treat the public well either. So that was one element. And then data. So intelligence data, really, it's the lifeblood of policing. This is how you identify patterns, repeat perpetrators, that they weren't doing that well. So we worked with them on that. And then the sixth was digital forensics. Virtually every criminal case police investigate these days has a digital element, whether that's phone exchanges, whether that's data picked up by routers or by something like that. And so they haven't really got a setup to do that well based on crime fiction you see on the you watch, you think, oh, they're totally on top of that, but really they're not using that very effectively. So we worked on how could police organizations improve those enablers so they actually put their officers in a position where they realistically could do their day-to-day activities of investigations, engaging with victims and survivors, and trying to find highly harmful repeat perpetrators a bit better. So yeah, that's the sort of framework we worked with.
Fantastic. And just a quick translation point for people in the US or the other parts of the Americas, a router in Britain means a router, because that's quite important as part of the
Yeah.
sixth pillar. I'm very disturbed by the fact that there are now six. I was very at home with the five. Now my world's been turned upside down, Prof. How did you do this to me? Say that the Prof was wonderful in iterating the 5+1 pillars, because the podcat Chinguri was acting up throughout that, and she had to do this watching the podcat, kissing me, licking me, and being generally difficult, but managed to sustain her argument brilliantly. I wanted to go back to something you mentioned en passant, if I may. And that was when you said that this big team that got the large grant, or you got the large grant, but there was a big team involved of 50 or so. This was, I think you described the group as largely feminist and left-leaning. So not your average police force. But that's something
Absolutely.
interesting also about criminology. When I was coming through, as they like to say in the United States, there was a thing called, I think it was called the National Deviancy Conference in Britain. And despite its name, this was a hotbed of leftist sedition. People really trying to bring Marxism in particular into debates in criminology. So
Mm.
I wondered if you could just take a step back from the research for a moment and give us a view of where, in inverted commas, we are in criminology. Is it just a bunch of feminists and leftists trying to excuse the working class for being violent?
I mean, I can't talk about criminology globally. I'll probably give a few of the UK here. So in the UK, probably by and large, that is the sort of outlook of much of criminology. We're also in a situation where in the 80s, criminologists and work quite closely with government. There were like many of the sort of big names were working within the Home Office. So that's the part of UK government responsible for policing, and Home Office research units were sort of moving in between academia and civil service. And there was quite a close sort of influencing. Now, this has very much changed, and I think there are various reasons for this. One is The whole field of crime and criminal justice has become so politicized, and it's increasingly a topic for elections. It's increasingly something of political party interest rather than the domain of experts. And then that makes engaging with it much more uncomfortable for us as academics, right? So this is not a space many want to be in. Similarly, government has become much more mistrusting of academics, so they try and keep us at arm's length also. So the two worlds have really drifted apart quite a bit. UK criminology is also largely qualitative in nature, so people prefer ethnographies, interviews, focus groups, sort of rich, deep engagement rather than quantification. So I know in the US there is a much larger part of criminology and criminal justice research that relies on um, large scale data and attempts of identifying causal mechanisms. So that is relatively small in the UK. Now I'm a hybrid, so I have a strong quant background, but I'm agnostic on methodology. For me, they're all tools, and it's a tool, and I will choose the tool that best allows me to ask questions. And uh, I like using a range of tools, and I think we become very unimaginative in our research questions if we only ever want to use one tool, because the tool limits the types of questions you can ask, and being more agnostic and not putting them in a hierarchy, but say, well, they're all tools. And different tools serve different purposes. This is forward. So that's sort of the space we're in. We're so yeah, so criminology in the UK is in a tendency more that way. And it was interesting for us to work in this way because most of the academics in our team, I mean, we were a mixed group from various universities, but really quite apprehensive of policing. And also, we were all incredibly angry with policing at the time because we had a huge scandal in the Met. An officer called Wayne Couzens, who turned out to be one of the UK's most prolific sex offenders, had, using his police uniform, abducted a young woman who, in broad daylight, came out of a subway tube station. He abducted her, he raped her, and he murdered her. And it absolutely, that was a serving officer of the Met Police, and it absolutely shocked the British public. It was just inconceivable. And it turned out he'd been operating in plain sight in the UK, in the Met, for a long time. So we didn't go in thinking these were all wonderful. We went in with a bit of apprehension, and officers went in with apprehension. I recall one conversation where the very senior officer across from me, he said, I've been an officer for the last 30 years. I'm out in the middle of the night, in the dark, in the rain, investigating things. And it's all very well, you academics in your heated offices, in your comfortable chairs. Um, I can't see how you would have anything to say to me about how I could do my job better. So we didn't start off, particularly. But what we did do is we all tried to put our preconceptions to one side, and we all did a leap of faith, policing more than us because there was no way academics would get damaged out of them. But for them, they couldn't control what we would be saying, and they were giving us a lot of access. So they were even more courageous, really. But I think we've got to have the courage of, as criminologists and as academics, to reweave ourselves back into the practice of criminal justice, especially when we don't agree with it.
This is an
Especially when we don't agree with it.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, Prof. And this is an interesting point because what you were describing earlier with the, I mean, in living memory, appalling Home Office. I'm saying that, I'm not suggesting you are, but that there was some sort of capture in this cozy movement between academia and the Home Office in the 80s. And then there's been too much of a divorce. Have I got that right? So what,
Yeah, I think we've
more
sort of basically
interaction?
we swung from one end to another.
Mm,
So
mm.
so So what is so now there is very little engagement in that way. I mean, people are trying to re-engage, or I should now probably disclose that for the last 2 years, I have been the independent advisor to the UK government in my field. And it's a role of speaking to, not for government. And you're not a civil servant. You're not, I'm an academic. They come to me for advice. You're not that integrated. It's not comparable to, say, the model in the 80s where people were employed in the civil servants within government and then went to academia and back and forth and back and forth. It's not like that. And it's almost a bit similar to policing, is there a trust has to be rebuilt, that even though you mightn't agree on everything and you sort of there is value in the academic perspective, and conversely, there is value in academics engaging with government and engaging with policing, engaging with the courts. Um, it's I think for me, this is also so. I grew up in Germany. I'm German. I've lived in the UK for 20 years now, but that's where I grew up. And growing up in Germany when I did, and there no school year passes where you do not talk about the Nazis and the Third Reich and all of that. And there's quite a lot of discussion about how this could come about. And I think that's so pertinent right now because we're seeing all of these shifts to questionable regimes around the world. And the one thing you learn is that you must never turn your back on power, especially if you don't agree with it. And it's not good enough to just talk to people with the same views as you, and you all just sit there and think this isn't okay, but nobody acts because it's good people not acting that allows bad things to happen. And I think that is very, very ingrained in me. So to me, if you've got a way of making a difference, you must. It's far more comfortable sitting in our ivory towers talking to like-minded people and exchanging our views. It's a lot less comfortable and it's a lot more unsettling to go out there and try and work with the real world. But to me, it doesn't feel like a choice, really.
Yes, a point well made, and a complex one too, in terms of wanting to avoid capture by these institutions, but wanting to avoid capture by the comfort of railing and ranting from your study. This is the difference
It's
between.
really, really hard. I mean, I wrestle with this a lot. So also in the Soteria project, so still going, but I stepped back from it after 2 years. So I did the first year, which was research only, the second year, which was trying to develop solutions to the problems, this actual operating model. And then in the third year, it went into implementation. And that's when I stepped out of the project. And I think you do have to constantly you've got to check, you've got to be very honest with yourself as to where you sit, and you have to be honest with yourself as to how institutionalized you get and how much objectivity you have. And it's a delicate balance, and it's probably impossible to always have it right. But when you notice you go off, you do have to course correct as to you've got to engage on eye level. There's no way of working well with practice if you don't show an openness, a willingness to listen, a willingness to sit with discomfort. But on the other hand, if you go too far, then the value goes too. So yeah, it's
Yeah, it's a
certainly a
balancing
difficult
act.
one. It's a difficult one, and I think in the fields we work in, within social science in general, but especially within criminology, where there is a lot of powers and authorities to be making choices about, it's not straightforward.
In a recent co-authored piece, you talk about the procedural injustice experienced by victims slash survivors. Could you go into the theory of procedural justice and injustice in a wee bit more detail, Prof? Because this is something I must admit that was pretty new to me when I encountered your work.
Okay. Yeah, so I think the piece you're referring to, I wrote with Jonathan Jackson and Ben Bradford. And we have worked, so this will become relevant. We've worked together before I started working on the topic of sexual violence on authority relationships between the police and the public. So the the police as authority holders, as representatives of the state and law, and with quite life-changing and life-ending powers over people. How do we as citizens, how can we trust them? What makes them legitimate power holders? And how can police act in ways that does make that power legitimate? And that's where procedural justice theory comes in. Sort of probably one of the sort of front runners of this would be Tom Tyler in the States. And what it boils down to is there are certain aspects of the quality of the engagements, not necessarily outcomes. So it's not necessarily whether at the end of it, if you're a suspect, you get arrested, say for your drink driving, or if you're a victim, whether somebody gets convicted. It's how you were treated as in the process. And there's a huge amount of literature that has established that for all sorts of encounters between the police and the public, but very few, hardly anyone has looked at this actually for victims of crime and specifically for sexual violence victims, where a lot is on the line. So procedural fairness or unfairness, there are sort of four key components.
And you
One,
promise it's four, it hasn't become five or
no, that one's
68.
always been four. It's
Still
probably because
four.
it
All right.
wasn't Betsy and me not being with the times, and because it's a sort of a more
So it's four with an option on artificial intelligence being added at some point.
well, people have applied it to how technology modifies the interactions between the state and
Blah,
police
blah, blah.
public.
Sorry. The four
Yeah,
pillars. Now that I feel comfortable that I have a
yeah.
cement base instead of one that is being added to in order to keep the edifice alive.
No, no, this one is four. And so the first one is voice. So are they actually listening to me? Do I have
Hmm.
a say in this process? Am I being done to? And I haven't got a say. Will the officer listen to my side of the story when, you're being stopped and searched and are you being have you got a way? Are they asking your side of the story? For victims and survivors of sexual violence, it's often, are you able to tell what happened to you in your own words? Or is the officer jumping to different things? It's also about active participation. Have you got some level of control over what happens here, some choices? Sort of, can you be a part of the process, or are you just being done to? Very important. And this could be small things, but there needs to be something of this kind. Then, are you being treated with dignity and respect? So, when that was initially looked at, it was often in situations like stop and search, which can be done in ways where everybody will stare at you and you look like an absolute criminal, when at this point in time, you're not, and they're unlikely to find anything on you. In the context of sexual violence, dignity and respect, some of it is about how the medical forensic examination is done. Sometimes this is a large number of victim survivors have disabilities, because you're more likely to be, sometimes, perpetrators seek that out. Are accommodations made that you can actually even just attend the building and there's dignity and respect? How are you being talked to?
Yes.
Very important, especially in sexual violence, where it's such an attack on personhood, and there is a
Mhm.
total, the perpetrator might even delight in humiliating you and taking away your dignity and respect, and your sense of control is being taken away. Like you have no agency. So that sense of agency, dignity, and respect, very important. The third is unbiased decision making. Is this officer making decisions that could be so consequential for me based on myth, stereotypes, racist views, homophobia, or are they being unbiased in their decision making, making decisions based on the facts and the rules rather than on something else? And the fourth is trustworthy motives. Do they have my best interests at heart? What's the motivate? How is this officer sort of driven? Those are sort of the components. And what we found is that all of these matter, just as they do with any police citizen encounter. But the one thing, and now it does feel like adding a component, is the bedrock, the straw man in procedural justice theory is always, it's about how you're treated, not about the outcome. It's not about instrumental, is this encounter with the police fundamentally going to leave me in a better place, but it's about how you're treated. And we found that for rape victim survivors, then that distinction isn't quite there in the same way. So they did really care about the quality of the investigation. Did officers look at all of the evidence? Did they take steps to protect me from the perpetrator? Did they tell me about my victim rights? In the UK, victims have rights, and police actually must tell victims about it, but they don't always do. So if you don't know your rights, you can't exercise them. It's pretty fundamental. Things like that. And so we sort of thought actually that's showing your care through competence. If you're running an incompetent, lax investigation where you don't even follow up when, say, a victim says, I could see that was a CCTV camera, and then later finds they never went to go and check it. They've handed over their mobile phone to show the messages, to find police have still got their mobile phone 2 years later, but nobody's actually checked it. That all of that matters. And the outcome of that is if police do that really well, because police are representatives of the state and law, it can, in some way, that relational aspect of that can show you that your value and worth as somebody who's been sexually violated, the police are there to listen to you, they're trying their best for you, can be restorative, it can help you move forward. But if you experience all these relational injustices, they don't listen to you, they don't take you seriously, you're not afforded dignity and respect, there is no care through competence, it just adds further harm. So then the policing process in itself becomes another way of creating further harm, secondary victimization. So that's sort of the relational injustice, which,
Mm.
based on some of the research I've done in the UK, this was a large number of survivors who've had their case, police know about it and began an investigation, say 3/4 would say that their mental health is worse as a direct result of what police did and didn't do in their case. Half would say they're less safe as a result of what police didn't and didn't do. So it's not, oh, the worst case is it didn't help. The worst case and a common case is that police have actually caused further harm.
Now, Prof, next question. I'm going to have to, for a moment, turn off my audio and video because the podcat has just positioned himself in a place to close the laptop lid. So I need to remove him. But my next question follows on in a way from this, but also from earlier remarks. And we've only got a couple of questions left. Don't worry, I know you've got the rest of your day ahead of you. This is about that 1% figure that you spoke about in the past that have then risen to 10. It's also about some of the stories you've just shared of people being so shoddily treated. And of course, there's the spectacular case of Wayne Couzens that you mentioned, who wasn't just an ordinary cop. He was in a very privileged position. He was in a high security detail, from what I recall. And it's to ask you this, how do you explain this? Is it to do with the fact that probably most police officers are men? Is it to do with hegemonic masculinity? Is it a question of patriarchy? How do you explain these problems? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I mean, they're quite systemic. They are not confined to the Metropolitan Police or even the UK. So there are various aspects to it. Certainly, people who like having power and authority over others will be attracted to positions like being a police officer, where, you'll have that position of power. So it certainly does attract people who are least suited to hold any power over other people. There's also quite well documented research on police cultures and the dynamics, especially Wayne Couzens was, as you mentioned, as part of a sort of specialist unit where the sort of in-group situation becomes such that there's quite a lot of peer pressure. There is a lot of sense of not speaking up, even when you see things that are clearly wrong and criminal. So those sort of setups aren't particularly conducive. I think there is a wider question about whether power corrupts humans and whether we just as a species are not very good at having power over other people. So yeah, it's a perennial issue. It's one that has never been solved. I'm not aware really of policing free of these issues anywhere.
Thanks, Prof. My last question, and is this, but before I pose it, just wanted to say that once you've answered, I wanted to give you the opportunity to add anything you wish, and that might take the form of going over terrain we've already covered, or it might take the form of something entirely new. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a close?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the last question before I invite you to add things is to ask you about your COVID-19 research.
Okay.
And I was living in Mexico City during the first two big outbreaks or the first big waves of COVID-19. Hundreds of thousands of people died in Mexico. But there was also, and this has since become somewhat controversial, but what was understood to be a very big uptick in domestic violence, gendered domestic violence. Now, especially in a country like this, these statistics are really often very complex, let's say. But I wondered if you could share with us, there are at least a couple of articles you've written that I've read about
Yeah.
COVID-19 and related questions.
Yeah. So when COVID-19 happened in countries that enforced some sort of lockdown, you would end up with situations where victims and perpetrators were basically stuck at home together with no intensifying the situation, with little ways of help seeking. And at first, the media reports really suggested that that hugely increased occurrences of domestic violence. Now, so it was sort of seen as another sort of pandemic of domestic violence. Now, what myself and others would say is that the data recording, as you mentioned, what tends to be recorded is moments of help seeking. So a domestic abuse victim going to the police is some sort of help seeking, right? It's because it's gotten to a crisis point and you just need someone to intervene. The same with calls to victim support organizations. So you're capturing the help seeking. You don't necessarily capture the amount of what's actually going on in the population. And we know those two are really out of kilter with one another.
Mhm.
And sort of studies that capture levels of violence, many of those have been discontinued in the pandemic. For example, in the UK, the British Crime Survey was paused because it's a face-to-face survey and they took some time to change that. So there is that element. I've compared the pandemic to football matches and Christmas in the patterns we see. So we see huge spikes in domestic violence after big football matches and after Christmas. Now, the football and the Christmas don't cause the domestic violence, neither does drinking in itself. Alcohol abuse doesn't, but they can trigger, they can heighten things. So the pandemic functioned in some of the same way. And what I found was some of the help seeking actually was delayed when the lockdowns lifted and there were opportunities to leave and leave safely. So some of it was delayed. we found that the severity of the domestic abuse and the way it impacts on victims, and not all victims are survivors, so I'm much more cautious in that context to talk about survivors because sadly not everybody survives domestic violence. The impacts became severer, and they became severer than in the UK. We went through 3 lockdowns, so sort of a cumulative impact there. So levels of domestic violence were high before, and they continue to be high after. It's certainly the lockdowns created unbearable situations, and additional danger for victims, but it's a lot more complicated than it looks in first instance. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Prof. Actually, we have a project here about gendered violence and the World Cup of men's football, because as you may be aware, a number of matches will be played in Mexico. And there are some horrific results of the correlation between men's football and gendered violence, though, as you say, this is not exactly a causal relationship, but there is an association that's quite
Yeah.
important.
It can escalate, it can trigger. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
and yeah, so in this context, for example, even the kickoff time makes a difference. So there who wins and loses, whose teams make a difference. It's a huge increase in demand for support services at that time, and there have long been discussions as to is there something organizers can do, because to be, we know it's going to happen. It's not a question of whether it will happen or not. It will happen. How what can be done to lessen it? But yeah, it's a topic.
Prof, I wanted to close by, as I said, inviting you to add anything you may wish. That could involve entirely new material, or it may involve retraversing terrain we've covered to a certain extent up to this point.
Mm. Perhaps the point I would close on is for those listening who are in, whether they're in research in academia or in any of those other fields, whatever your field might be or your interest is, to think about being courageous in the questions you ask, the places you engage with, and the discomfort you can tolerate to try and to me, it creates a tremendous sense of meaning and purpose to engage outside of academia, and to think about what that might mean for anyone personally, to seek out those other contexts. And I think as curiosity is so important. Yeah. And I think especially for those working on topics that can be a bit heavy, that can feel like a difficult one to engage with. Adding that in, I think makes it more sustainable also as a topic to work on long term.
Thanks so much. That's a very inspirational peroration. Greatly appreciate this chance to learn from you, in addition to what I've read of your work, but through this discussion today.
Thank you for having me, Toby. It's a wonderful conversation.